Just before we get into today's video, just wanted to say a quick thank you to the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts for teaming up with us yet again and sponsoring another of our The Story of America video series, covering so far everything from Amelia Earhart and the dawn of U.S. commercial aviation to the forgotten other guy who co-invented the telephone and helped make the U.S. a naval powerhouse, to the true story of the Amistad, to that time Ben Franklin and John Adams slept together and the hilarity that ensued, covering how those two men teamed up on multiple occasions to help create the United States, utilizing their own, rather diametrically and sometimes humorously opposed methods. As for Quincy, which yes, is pronounced Quincy, not Quincy, the city is home to the Adams National Historic Park, which preserves the home of Presidents John Adams and John Quincy Adams. In Quincy, you can explore the birthplaces of these iconic individuals and walk the same halls as they once did, immersing yourself in the beginnings of the United States. But Quincy isn't all about the past, it's a city that beautifully blends history with present-day adventures and experiences. From the iconic USS Salem to the stunning views of the Blue Hills and the architectural elegance of Old City Hall and the Thomas Crane Library, there's something here for everyone. And let's not forget the Epicurean delight that is Quincy's food scene, with an array of global and local flavors. It's a culinary journey that you can't miss. To discover more about what Quincy has in store for you, check out discoverquincy.com. It's time to step into history and create some unforgettable memories. Now let's get into today's video. At 9 in the morning on July the 1st, 1946, Major Harold Wood, bombardier of the B-29 Superfortress, Dave's Dream, peered through his bomb sight at a massive fleet of warships gathered below. As the crosshairs fell over his target, he released his weapon, and the pilot, Major Woodrow Swancutt, pulled the aircraft into a sharp turn. Seconds later, a blinding flash filled the air as an atomic bomb detonated over the turquoise waters of the Pacific. This was not some alternate timeline where the nascent Cold War suddenly went hot, but rather an elaborate test dubbed Able, part of a larger series of nuclear experiments called Operation Crossroads, carried out at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And while the target fleet included several former Axis ships, including the Japanese battleship Nagato and the German heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, the vast majority were American, a motley array of obsolete battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, landing craft, and various auxiliary vessels. And at the very center of the assembly, painted bright orange to serve as an aiming point, was a truly remarkable vessel, the battleship USS Nevada. A revolutionary design when she entered service in 1916, Nevada was present at Pearl Harbour on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, when the surprise attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy marked the ascendancy of the aircraft carrier over the battleship. And now at the end of her career, she bore witness to another technological revolution, the dawning of the atomic age. This is the remarkable story of the USS Nevada, a ship that served through one of the most eventful periods in the history of naval warfare. USS Nevada, BB-36, was laid down on November the 4th, 1912 at the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, the third U.S. Navy vessel to be named after the 36th state. At the time of her construction, Nevada represented a revolution in battleship design, likened by many contemporary commentators to paradigm-shifting British battleship HMS Dreadnought, launched in 1906. 178 meters or 583 feet long, with a beam of 29 meters or 95 feet and displacing 27,500 tons, Nevada was not only larger than any previous American battleship, but faster as well. Her 18,500 kilowatt or 24,800 shaft horsepower geared steam turbines, the first installed on any U.S. battleship, giving her a top speed of 20.5 knots, equivalent to 38 kilometers or 24 miles per hour. These turbines were driven by 12 boilers fired by oil instead of coal, another key innovation which allowed more fuel to be carried and refueling to be carried out more efficiently, as well as up to 200 crew and significant living and cargo space to be eliminated. On top of this, it allowed the ship's range to be increased to an impressive 8,000 nautical miles, equivalent to 14,816 kilometers or 9,206 statute miles. This range was seen as a key to helping enforce the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. policy of opposing foreign military intervention in the Western Hemisphere, one of the key architects of which, John Quincy Adams, was also from the birthplace of the Nevada, Quincy, Massachusetts. Beyond this, the long range was seen as integral to helping carry out War Plan Orange, a theoretical confrontation with Imperial Japan in the Pacific Ocean. Other innovations in Nevada's design included the first triple-gun turrets installed on a U.S. battleship, When launched, she was armed with 10 14-inch or 356mm guns with a range of 21,000 meters or 68,000 feet, mounted in double and triple turrets fore and aft, 21 5-inch or 127mm guns in casements on her two beams, and two 3-inch or 76.2mm anti-aircraft guns. This was a continuation of the design trend pioneered by the HMS Dreadnought. Late 19th century battleships had primarily batteries composed of multiple different calibers, while Dreadnought-style designs concentrated this armament in just a few turrets of the same caliber. Nevada was also armed with two 21-inch or 533mm torpedo tubes mounted on each beam below the waterline, and was the first US battleship to adopt the so-called all-or-nothing armor scheme, wherein key areas of the ship, like command spaces and ammunition magazines, were encased in thick armor, while other areas received no real protection. This maximized survivability while reducing weight, allowing for greater speed and heavier armament to be carried. At its thickest, the armor in the central citadel measured 13.5 inches or 342mm thick. Finally, perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Nevada as launched were her two lattice or basket masts mounted fore and aft of the main superstructure. First introduced on the South Carolina class battleships in 1910, these skeletal masts, based on the hyperboloid lattice structure devised by Russian engineer Vladimir Shukov, were intended to isolate delicate range-finding equipment for the guns from the vibration of the engines and waves, and to be less vulnerable to enemy fire. Thanks to all these innovations, the Nevada's design became the basis for the US Navy's so-called standard-type battleships, which would ultimately number 12 vessels across 5 classes: the USS Nevada and Oklahoma of the Nevada class, the USS Pennsylvania and Arizona of the Pennsylvania class, the USS New Mexico, Mississippi, and Idaho of the New Mexico class, the USS Tennessee and California of the Tennessee class, and the USS Colorado, Maryland, and West Virginia of the Colorado class. 7 more standard types were planned: the Colorado class, USS Washington, and the South Dakota class, USS South Dakota, Indiana, Montana, North Carolina, Iowa, and Massachusetts, but following the signing of the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, which limited the total tonnage of ships that could be deployed by the navies of the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Italy, and Japan, these ships were canceled and scrapped. Going back to the Nevada, following 41 months of construction at the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, the USS Nevada was launched on July the 11th, 1914, sponsored and christened by Miss Eleanor Siebert, niece of Nevada Governor Tasker Odie. She had been preceded on March 23rd of that year by her sister ship, USS Oklahoma. The two ships were nearly identical except in their propulsion systems, with Oklahoma being fitted with more conventional triple expansion reciprocating steam engines instead of Nevada's geared turbines. This was done so that the performance of the two technologies could be compared directly. Following an extensive set of sea trials in November of 1915, in which her fuel consumption was found to be significantly better than specified in the Navy contract, Nevada was sent to the Boston and New York Navy yards to be fitted with her armament, ammunition, hoists, and other equipment. Finally, on March the 11th, 1916, she was commissioned into the US Navy with William S. Sims as her first captain. She then sailed to her home base in Norfolk, Virginia, and spent the first part of the First World War conducting various training cruises and fleet exercises along the Atlantic seaboard. The United States finally entered the First World War on April 6, 1917. However, Nevada and Oklahoma were not immediately sent overseas, ironically because they were too advanced. Most Royal Navy warships still ran on coal, meaning there were insufficient bunker oil facilities on the other side of the Atlantic to support the Nevada class. Thus, the older, coal-fired battleships USS Delaware, Florida, Wyoming, New York, and Texas were sent instead. But finally, in August of 1918, Nevada, along with her sister ship Oklahoma and the Florida-class battleship USS Utah, were dispatched to Berehaven, Ireland, where they formed Battleship Division 6, or the Bantry Bay Squadron, under Rear Admiral Thomas S. Rogers, tasked with preventing the breakout of German surface raiders into the Atlantic. However, the German Navy never attempted such a breakout, and the war ended 3 months later on November the 11th without Nevada nor the rest of the Bantry Bay Squadron having ever engaged the enemy. However, Nevada did play a key, if minor, role in the conclusion of the conflict when, on December the 13th, 1918, she and a flotilla of 9 other battleships and 28 destroyers escorted the ocean liner SS George Washington, carrying US President Woodrow Woodrow Wilson to the Paris Peace Conference. The flotilla sailed for home the following day, arriving in New York City on December the 26th. Throughout the interwar period, Nevada served in both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets, participating in various fleet maneuvers and goodwill tours. For example, she represented the United States at the Peruvian Centennial Exposition in 1921, ferried USS Secretary of State Charles Evan Hughes to the Centennial of Brazilian Independence celebration in 1922, and participated in a goodwill cruise to Australia and New Zealand in 1925. Interestingly, the second voyage is widely credited with introducing the sport of baseball to Brazil. In August of 1927, Nevada put into the Norfolk Navy Yard for extensive modernization. Her distinctive lattice masts, which were found to be vulnerable to damage in heavy seas, were replaced with more conventional tripod masts, while her steam turbines were swapped out for more powerful units salvaged from the canceled and scrapped USS North Dakota. Her 12 original Yarrow boilers were also replaced with 6 more efficient Bureau Express boilers. The elevation of her main guns was increased to 30 degrees, increasing their range. Her secondary 5-inch armament were raised to a higher deck, and thick anti-torpedo armor bulges added to her lower hull. Finally, a pair of catapults were added to her upper turrets to launch Vought O2U-3 Corsair observation aircraft. With modernization work complete, in January of 1930, Nevada was relaunched and assigned to the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet. The next 11 years were largely uneventful, but when, on the morning of Sunday, December the 7th, 1941, the United States was violently dragged into the Second World War, Nevada would find herself right on the firing line. That morning, Nevada was in Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, the home base for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Moored on the easternmost end of the Battleship Row on the south shore of Ford Island, she sat just east of the ill-fated USS Arizona. At 7:40 a.m., members of Nevada's crew were raising her flag while her band played morning colors, when suddenly aircraft from the Kido Butai, an Imperial Japanese Navy carrier task force stationed 500 kilometers north of Oahu, suddenly appeared overhead. Nevada was immediately attacked by Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, receiving one direct hit. While the torpedo did not penetrate the hull, buckling of the hull plates caused serious flooding, causing the ship to lisp by 5 degrees. However, the crew quickly corrected this via counter-flooding. Not being moored next to any other ships, Nevada was uniquely free to maneuver, with Commanding Officer Francis Scanlon ashore, Senior Officer present afloat, or SOPA Lieutenant Commander Frank Thomas ordered the engine room to raise steam. Fortuitously, Ensign Joe Tasic, the officer of the deck, that morning had previously ordered a second boiler lit in order to transfer over power, making this process much faster. And so it was that at 8:40 a.m., amid fire, explosions, smoke, and strafing aircraft, Nevada finally got underway, steaming into the harbor basin. Immediately, she came under attack from dive bombers from the Japanese second wave, whose crews hoped to sink her in the channel and bottle up the fleet in the harbor. She quickly received 6 bomb hits in rapid succession, inflicting heavy damage to her superstructure and touching off the gasoline tanks from her spotter aircraft. Miraculously, however, her powder and shell magazines were empty that morning, preventing the conflagration from touching off a massive explosion of the kind that obliterated the USS Arizona, moored right next to the Nevada. Nonetheless, the gasoline fires prevented access to flooding compartments, while poorly sealed bulkheads allowed flooding to spread more quickly than anticipated. As a result, Nevada was ordered to beach herself to prevent her from sinking in deep water or blocking the harbor channel. With the help of the tug Hoga and the minesweeper Avocet, she successfully grounded herself on a coral ledge at Hospital Point at 10:30 a.m. In the course of her brief action, Nevada suffered a total of 60 killed and 109 wounded, though her anti-aircraft guns managed to shoot down no fewer than 5 Japanese aircraft, including the Kate torpedo bomber which had first damaged her, the only ship that morning to do so using her secondary armament. She was also the only battleship to get underway during the attack, an act hailed as, to quote, the only bright spot in an otherwise dismal and depressing morning. As covered in far greater detail in our previous video, A Failed Attack, What Happened to the Ships at Pearl Harbor, the smoke over Pearl Harbor had not even cleared when the grueling and gruesome task of raising and salvaging the damaged ships began. On this note, despite the enduring infamy of the Pearl Harbor attack, it who was in many ways a total failure. While the Japanese had managed to sink or severely damage 18 ships in less than 2 hours, all but 2, the USS Arizona and the Utah, were ultimately raised, repaired, and returned to service. The Nevada, which had beached herself on a shallow reef, proved particularly easy to salvage, though easy here is a relative term, for mapping and plugging the various breaches on her hull still required Navy divers to operate in pitch-dark, oil-choked waters. Decomposition of organic material within the hull also caused problems when, on February 7, 1942, 2 salvage workers were killed by the release of toxic hydrogen sulfide gas from a sealed compartment. But by February 13, 1942, the main torpedo breach in Nevada's hull had been patched with a gigantic custom-made wooden plug, and the ship was refloated and towed into dry dock 2. After initial patches, Nevada sailed for Puget Sound for more permanent repairs and upgrades. At this point, originally Nevada was to receive only minor upgrades and be relegated to secondary duties, but due to urgent need for warships, this was soon changed and she instead received a new secondary armament of 32 40mm anti-aircraft guns, 41 20mm guns, and 16 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns. Her conning tower and mainmast were also cut down and her superstructure modified to include an open bridge and more spaces for radar and fire control equipment. The upgrades were completed by October of 1942, whereupon, after completing shakedown and training cruises, she was assigned to Task Group 51.1 in support of the Aleutian Island campaigns to retake the islands of Attu and Kiska from the Japanese. In June of 1943, Nevada was sent to the Norfolk Naval Yard in Virginia for further modernizations, including the addition of large search radar lattice to her mainmast. Then, unlike most of her sisters in the Pacific Fleet, she was assigned to convoy escort duty in the Atlantic. However, the crippling of the German battleship Tirpitz by British submarines in September of 1943 and the sinking of the battleship Scharnhorst in December greatly diminished the threat from surface raiders. Instead, Nevada, along with the USS Arkansas and Texas, was tasked with performing shore bombardment in support of the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944. Operating off Utah Beach, Nevada fired 337 14-inch and 2,700 5-inch shells during the first day of the landings. She later bombarded German gun positions near Cherbourg before being moved to the Mediterranean in support of Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. Operating off Toulon, Nevada, along with the American battleships USS Arkansas and Texas, the American heavy cruisers USS Augusta, Tuscaloosa, and Quincy, the British battleships HMS Ramillies, and the Free French battleship Lorraine engaged in an extended gun duel with a German fortress nicknamed Big Willie, which was armed with the 13.4-inch gun salvaged from the scuttled French battleship Provence. While the duel was something of a draw, it succeeded in diverting the fortress's attention from the landing taking place nearby. During the operation, the Nevada was also credited with single-handedly neutralizing the Vichy French battlecruiser Strasbourg with a direct hit from one of her 14-inch guns. Following the success of Operation Dragoon, Nevada sailed to New York for another refit, during which the 3 guns from her No. 1 turret were replaced by relined guns salvaged from the USS Arizona. She then returned to the Pacific, where she performed shore bombardment off Iwo Jima in February of 1945 and off Okinawa in March. During the former action, she was assigned to support 12 landing craft infantry carrying underwater demolition teams. When these vessels came under heavy fire from Japanese shore batteries, Nevada charged ahead at full speed, guns blazing, and placed herself between the shore and the landing craft, allowing them to escape. Later, while off Okinawa on March the 27th, Nevada was struck by a kamikaze aircraft near her No. 3 turret, killing 11 men and wounding 49, while on April the 15th, she was struck by 5 shells from Japanese 4.7-inch shore batteries, but suffered only minor damage. After being repaired, she was placed in a shore bombardment rotation for Operation Downfall, but the Japanese surrendered before she could be brought to bear. Nevada was also present in Tokyo Bay during the formal surrender ceremony on September 2, 1945, after which she returned to the United States for decommissioning. But as fate would have it, Nevada was to play one final dramatic role in the history of naval warfare. Having served through the age of the dreadnought and the rise of the aircraft carrier, the cheer-up ship, as she was known to her crew, would now bear witness to the dawn of the atomic age. While it was clear to all that dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 had forever changed modern warfare, What was less clear was exactly how it had changed. As the Second World War gave way to the Cold War, military strategists began to wonder how best to use this awesome new weapon. Could it be deployed tactically on the battlefield, or was it only good for destroying civilian centers? And what kinds of targets was it most effective against? Particularly concerned about its role in the nascent atomic age was the US Navy, which resented the Army Air Force's monopoly on the delivery of nuclear weapons. The Air Force, meanwhile, argued that naval ships were extremely vulnerable to nuclear attack, and that the advent of such weapons had effectively made navies completely obsolete. After all, one of the few places a nuclear weapon could be deployed with little risk of civilian casualties was against any naval surface vessel out on a mission, with seemingly little any such vessel could do to defend against a nuclear attack. Into this bitter dispute waded one Lewis Strauss, aide to the Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, future chairman of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, memorably played by Robert Downey Jr. in Oppenheimer. Strauss suggested staging a series of tests to evaluate the effects of nuclear weapons on naval vessels. If such a test is not made, Strauss argued, there will be loose talk to the effect that the fleet is obsolete in the face of this new weapon, and this will militate against appropriations to preserve a post-war navy of the size now planned. The test series, dubbed Operation Crossroads and commanded by Vice Admiral Henry P. Blandy, was officially approved and announced by U.S. President Harry S. Truman in January of 1946. The location of the test was Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, 4,000 kilometers or 2,500 miles west of Hawaii. The atoll was chosen for a number of reasons, including its isolation, favorable weather, suitability as a sheltered anchorage, proximity to the Army Air Force Base at Kwajalein, and its small population. Nonetheless, that population, comprising 167 Marshallese natives, would have to be evacuated prior to the tests. In February of 1946, Commodore Benjamin Wyatt, military governor of the Marshall Islands, gathered the Bikini Islanders after their Sunday church service and asked them and their monarch, King Judah Kesabuki, would you be willing to sacrifice your island for the welfare of all men? After a brief, if confused, discussion with his people, King Judah agreed, stating, if the United States government and the scientists of the world want to use our islands and atoll for furthering development which with God's blessing will result in kindness and benefit to all mankind, my people would be pleased to go elsewhere. We will go believing that everything is in the hands of God. And so it was that on March the 7th, the US Navy evacuated all 167 Bikini Islanders to Rongerik Atoll, 216 kilometers away. Though they believed their relocation was temporary and that they would soon return home, history would have other plans. Meanwhile, Bikini was invaded by a massive armada comprising 242 ships, 156 aircraft, and more than 42,000 US military and civilian personnel. In stark contrast to the intense secrecy surrounding the Trinity test, the world's first nuclear explosion conducted on July 16, 1945, Operation Crossroads soon became the global media event of the year, acquiring an almost carnival-like atmosphere. Hundreds of journalists, civilians, scientists from 15 universities, and several private companies, as well as representatives from Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, Egypt, France, Mexico, the Netherlands, Poland, and the Soviet Union, were invited to witness the test from aboard the command ship USS Appalachian. Nonetheless, the operation immediately drew some severe criticism from various parties. For example, Manhattan Project scientists, including scientific director J. Robert Oppenheimer, argued that such testing was unnecessary and that the desired results could be more easily and safely obtained in the laboratory. Furthermore, they warned that detonating a nuclear weapon underwater would create a radioactive witch's brew that could devastate the local environment. On the diplomatic front, politicians like Secretary of State James F. Burns and Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace feared that Crossroads would anger the Soviets and scuttle the recently proposed Acheson-Lilienthal plan, which sought to place nuclear weapons under international control as a safeguard against future conflict. Indeed, many saw it as strangely hypocritical for the United States to pursue nuclear testing while simultaneously pushing for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Further objections came from animal rights groups who protested the use of the animals as radiological test subjects, as well as Congress, who questioned the wisdom of destroying $450 million worth of target ships. On the latter point, Vice Admiral Blandy countered that, being largely obsolete types, these ships were actually worth only around $3.7 million in scrap value. Yet despite these objections, the tests went ahead as planned, though President Truman agreed to delay them by 6 weeks in order to allow Congress to more thoroughly discuss the matter. As originally envisioned, Operation Crossroads comprised 3 different tests, codenamed Able, Baker, and Charlie, after the joint Army-Navy radiotelephony spelling alphabet in use at the time. All 3 tests would use a version of the same 23-kiloton Mark III Fat Man plutonium implosion device dropped on Nagasaki, with the Able device being airdropped on the target fleet by a Boeing B-29 Superfortress bomber. As for the Baker device, it was to be detonated underwater in the Atoll Lagoon, and the Charlie device detonated in a deeper water outside the lagoon. 2 of the bombs were given nicknames by Navy personnel, the Able device being dubbed Gilda after the Rita Hayworth movie that came out that same year, and the Baker device Helen of Bikini. As a target, the Navy assembled a small armada of 95 vessels, the 6th largest navy in the world at the time. The majority of these were obsolete or surplus US Navy vessels, among which were the battleships Arkansas, New York, Pennsylvania, and of course the Nevada, the cruisers Pensacola and Salt Lake City, the aircraft carriers Saratoga and Independence, as well as 16 destroyers, 8 submarines, and various other amphibious assault and auxiliary craft. Like Nevada, the Pennsylvania was also a survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack. Rounding out the target fleet were 3 vessels captured from the Axis powers, the Japanese battleship Nagato and the light cruiser Saga, and the German heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. The target ships were anchored in a roughly circular array 2 kilometers in diameter, 6 kilometers southeast of the main island of Bikini. Nevada was given pride of place right in the center of the fleet, painted bright orange to act as a target for the attacking bomber aircraft. The ships were loaded with sample loads of fuel and ammunition, though the Army's suggestion that they be given full cargoes was rejected by Vice Admiral Blandy on the grounds that the resulting explosions and the fires would cause too many vessels to sink. This in turn reignited suspicions that the Navy was trying to rig the test in its own favor. In response, Blandy agreed to pack more target ships closer together than initially planned and created a civilian committee to evaluate the final results. To document everything in the tests, some 25,000 scientific instruments, including radiation detectors, pressure gauges, and both still and motion picture cameras, were installed aboard the target ships, as well as support ships anchored 35 kilometers away, and they also had instrumented aircraft circling overhead. Indeed, more than 9 million still images and 1.5 million feet of motion picture film would be shot over the course of the operation, accounting for an astounding nearly half of the world's supply of photographic material at the time. To gauge the biological effects of the flash and the radiation, 5,664 animals, including 200 pigs, 200 mice, 60 guinea pigs, 204 goats, and 5,000 rats were penned above and below decks on 22 target ships. Some animals also had their fur shaved to better simulate the effects on human skin, while others were dressed in standard Navy anti-flash clothing or smeared in anti-flash cream. In the wake of the detonations, remotely operated drone aircraft, including Grumman F-6F Hellcats from the aircraft carrier USS Shangri-La and Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, would be flown through the mushroom cloud to collect radiation samples. It was, in other words, to be the largest and most well-documented scientific military experiment in history. Able Day finally arrived on July 1st, 1946. The B-29 Superfortress, Dave's dream of the 509th Bombardment Group, took off from Kwajalein and at 9 a.m. local time dropped Gilda onto the target fleet. The bomber, originally named Big Stink, had been the photographic aircraft during the August 9th, 1945 atomic bombing of Nagasaki, but was renamed in honor of Dave Semple, a bombardier who was killed during a practice mission on March 7th, 1946. Gilda detonated at an altitude of 158 meters, unleashing a blinding flash and a giant orange-brown mushroom cloud that towered over the lagoon. But when observers turned their gaze towards the target fleet, the sight they were greeted with was surprisingly anticlimactic. As Soviet observer Simon Alexandrov recalled, the only visible results from the air were 2 ships sunk and 1 on its side, plus 4 more ships burning. Everyone had the feeling that something had gone wrong. In fact, Gilda had missed its aiming point by nearly 650 meters. As a result, only 5 ships were sunk. 2 attack transports, the USS Gillam and Carlisle, sank immediately, 2 destroyers, USS Anderson and Lamson, within hours, and the Japanese cruiser Sakawa the following day. The rest of the target fleet suffered only minor damage and were minimally contaminated by radiation, allowing them to be reboarded within hours, meaning only around 10% of the test animals died immediately, while around 25% ultimately perished from the effects of radiation. The overall effect of the test was to rob the atomic bomb of much of the awe and mystique it had acquired in the public consciousness. As Time magazine reported, the bomb had grown a little less awful as a result of Bikini. Its apparently infinite power was finite after all. The US Navy, however, understandably was delighted with Admiral James Forrestal declaring that the American Navy will continue to be the most efficient, the most modern, and the most powerful in the world. Unsurprisingly, the Navy was once again accused of rigging the test in its favor. However, a thorough investigation failed to determine the exact cause of the overshoot, with the most commonly accepted theory being that one of the bomb's box fins had collapsed as it fell towards the target. But while the able detonation made the atomic bomb look like something of a damp squib, Baker would reveal the weapon's true destructive potential and yield some of the most iconic and enduring images of the atomic age. For the test, Helen of Bikini, identical to Gilda in design and yield, was suspended 27 meters beneath the target fleet from the amphibious assault ship LSM-60. Detonated at 8:35 a.m. on July the 25th, the Baker shot produced a unique, awesome spectacle unlike anything seen before or since. As New York Times correspondent William Lawrence wrote, "For a time it looked as though a giant mountain had risen from the sea, as though we were watching the formation of a continent, and then it took the shape of a giant chain of mountains, covered with snow glistening in the sun." Major General Nichols of Vice Admiral Blandy's staff also described the awesome spectacle. Niagara Falls and reverse shot up over an area fully 2,200 feet in diameter. Millions of tons of water rose about 5,000 feet, and finally vapor and steam came out on top. As the tons of water came tumbling back into the lagoon, what appeared like a tremendous breaking wave broke out of the mass of water and advanced towards the next circle of target ships. Still and moving images of the test revealed the sheer scale of the explosion, with even battleships like Nagato and Nevada looking like toy boats next to the gargantuan cauliflower-shaped water column thrown up by the bomb. The underwater blast proved far more effective than the able airburst, completely vaporizing LSM-60, displacing 2 million tons of water, and creating a tsunami that immediately sank the battleship USS Arkansas, the submarines USS Pilotfish, Apagon, and Skipjack, and the concrete yard oiler YO-160. Contrary to popular belief, Arkansas was not lifted vertically by the blast. The dark, vertical object seen in many pictures of the Baker water column is merely a gap produced by Arkansas's superstructure. Instead, the shockwave and tsunami completely sheared off said superstructure and rolled Arkansas onto its back, whereupon the battleship immediately flooded and sank to the bottom of the lagoon. But while the remaining target ships were not immediately sunk, many were severely damaged, suffering massive leaks that threatened to sink them within hours. But when Navy crews reboarded the ships to assess and repair the damage, they discovered a far more serious problem. The holes were dangerously radioactive. As the Manhattan Project scientists had predicted, the underwater detonation had contaminated the water with a witch's brew of fission products and unconsumed plutonium, which washed over the ship as a 270-meter tall base surge when the water column fell back to Earth. So extensive was the contamination that many ships could not be safely approached, and several, including the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga and the Japanese battleship Nagato, sank before their hulls could be repaired. In all, 14 ships sank as a direct result of the blast. Meanwhile, the other ships proved nearly impossible to decontaminate, either by scrubbing with soap and water or sandblasting paint off metal surfaces. And while decontamination crews were limited to shifts of no more than a few minutes, few were issued any kind of protective equipment, and many suffered from acute radiation sickness and long-term health issues like cancer. The vast majority of the test animals, mainly pigs and rats, also died within a few days of the tests. Despite previous warnings by nuclear scientists saying exactly this would happen, the extent of the contamination wrought by Crossroads Baker caught the US Navy brass completely by surprise, revealing that the greatest threat posed by nuclear weapons to naval ships was not necessarily the blast or tsunamis, but radiation which would render any ship uninhabitable. Worse still, the contamination was not limited to the target fleet or even the Bikini Lagoon. The base surge rendered the main island of Bikini uninhabitable for a week, while radioactive vapor drifted east where the Bikini Islanders had been relocated to. It was an ominous sign of things to come. The test also produced serious fallout of the political kind, as Secretary of State James Byrne had feared the Soviets used it as an excuse to reject an updated version of the Acheson-Lilienthal plan, known as the Baruch Plan, and the dream of achieving international control of nuclear weapons fell apart. 3 years later, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, ending the United States' nuclear monopoly and pushing the Cold War into a dangerous new phase. The test was also a public relations disaster for the US Navy. Though originally intended to allay public fears about nuclear weapons and demonstrate the invulnerability of the US Navy, Operation Crossroads had achieved just the opposite, stoking nuclear malaise to an all-time high. Indeed, a 1947 report on the tests in Life magazine informed viewers that if all the ships at Bikini had been fully manned, the Baker Day bomb would have killed 35,000 crewmen. If such a bomb were dropped below New York's battery in a stiff south wind, 2 million people would die. Shortly after the Baker shot, it was decided to cancel the third planned deep-water test, codenamed Charlie. While this decision largely stemmed from the Navy's inability to decontaminate the remaining target ships, the Army also argued that using the nation's tiny nuclear stockpile in testing was impeding efforts to develop smaller, more efficient nuclear weapons. The scientific objectives of Charlie would eventually be achieved on May 14, 1955 during Operation Wigwam, conducted 800 kilometers southwest of San Diego. A 30-kiloton Mark 90 Betty nuclear depth charge was detonated at a depth of 610 meters, with instrumented miniature submarine holes known as squaws being used to gauge the effects. But the most tragic fallout of Operation Crossroads would fall upon the 167 original inhabitants of Bikini Atoll. Rongerik Atoll proved insufficiently productive to support the evacuees, so after months of hardship, the islanders were moved to Kwajalein Atoll. In 1970, Bikini Atoll was finally declared safe for human habitation and the islanders allowed to return. However, less than a decade later, it was found that levels of cesium-137 in the islanders' bodies had increased by 75%, the isotope having become concentrated in coconut palms and other common food plants. As a result, in 1978, the Bikini Islanders were evacuated once again, this time to Kili Island. Their descendants remain there to this day, waiting for the day when they can finally return to their traditional home. Going back to the testing, within 2 months of the Baker shot, the radiation had sufficiently decayed for some of the larger ships to be towed away for further study. The USS Pennsylvania and the German cruiser Prinz Eugen were taken to Kwajalein, and the USS Nevada and New York to Pearl Harbour. After being thoroughly examined on July 31st, 1948, Nevada was towed out to a spot 65 miles southwest of Oahu and used as a gunnery target by the battleship USS Iowa and other vessels. Stubborn to the last, Nevada continued to earn her moniker of Unsinkable, withstanding pummeling by hundreds of shells before finally having to be finished off with the torpedo dropped from a Grumman TBM Avenger aircraft. Her wreckage still lies where she sank at a depth of 4,600 meters or 15,400 feet. And so it was that from the time of her launching, only shortly after a period humans were still hitching up covered wagons, to the oil fires of Pearl Harbor, to the atomic fires of Operation Crossroads, USS Nevada lived through an unprecedented period of upheaval and advancements in the history of naval warfare, serving with distinction throughout.